I can still recall the grit of that coal dust grinding against my teeth in the winter of 1960s, the way it clung to my tongue no matter how much water I forced down, and how every breath tasted like the inside of a stovepipe as we worked that lonely stretch of Nevada nothingness. 30 miles from a camp that no map remembers, we lived along a forgotten rail spur that people once called Dry Camp Number 3, a run of warped board shacks and canvas roofs that snapped in the wind like old sails. To me, it was simply a freezing bunk where my feet stuck out past the blanket and the walls rattled whenever the ridge sighed. I had drifted down from Utah after the copper layoffs and followed rumors of a fat coal seam buried shallow under these gray hills. By the time I arrived, the crews had carved their way deep into a low ridge behind camp, digging with the excitement of men who believed fortune hid just below their boots. The company man, Briggs, a short fellow with stiff colors and a watch chain he liked to touch when he spoke, kept telling us we'd all be well off in a year and gone in 2. He never went underground himself, but he sure liked to paint pictures of riches when standing in clean clothes above the shaft. My crew held 6 men. I bunked beside a lanky Irishman named Connolly, whose patchy beard made him look half frozen even when he laughed. Alvarez, a Mexican miner who'd worked silver in Virginia City, slept on my other side and kept insisting the coal here smelled wrong, too dry, too stale, as though the hill had been empty too long. Then there was Sparrow, a wiry boy who claimed 18 but couldn't have been more than 16, always watching us with those big eyes that tried to look older than his voice. The Ward brothers, Eli and Thomas, broad Kansan men who favored silence and cheap tobacco, rounded us out. Our routine was simple enough. Wake before the sun, swallow down beans and hard bread, then followed the frosted tracks to the drift mouth, where lamps hung like cold stars, waiting for hands to claim them. Inside the entrance, the air turned cold and heavy, swallowing lamplight so quickly it always felt like we stepped into a throat of stone. The rails gleamed faintly under the flame, and when the 6 of us pushed the first load, our echoes came back close enough to feel like someone else breathing beside us. For the first weeks, nothing happened that didn't happen in any mine. Fallen timber now and then, tempers flaring in the tight spaces, bruises from swinging picks and cramped tunnels. The Shoshone families who passed near camp kept their distance, watching with unreadable faces. I never thought much of it until later. It was Alvarez who first said the coal didn't sound right. One night, while a cold wind scraped dust through the bunkhouse walls, he rolled his shoulders and told us he'd struck hollows behind the seam, empty pockets where the rock felt wrong beneath his pick. Old places, he called them. Connolly laughed and asked what kind of creature made holes in solid stone. Alvarez only shrugged and stared at the floor. 2 days later, we found out. We were about 100 yards inside, chipping deeper along the downward slant of the seam. Sweat glued my shirt to my back despite the cold draft, and the lamplight jumped with every swing. Then my pick hit a strange note, hollow, like tapping the inside of a barrel. The next strike punched straight through into nothing. A gust of stale, unmoving air washed over my hands, dry as old paper. We froze where we stood. For a full breath, nothing moved, except the faint wick flame trembling. Then Connolly crouched, lifted his lamp, and peered into the narrow split. The darkness beyond looked thicker than the tunnel around us, as if the light died before it even touched the walls. We widened the opening until a man could squeeze through. Sparrow sprinted back to fetch Briggs, who arrived with a brand new lamp, clean boots, and a scarf that didn't know dust. He nodded at the gap, asked how large we thought the hollow might be, and insisted we survey it before the next shift. If it was unstable, we'd timber it. If it opened somewhere promising, the company would cut new headings. That was his answer to everything. Push further. Later that evening, I noticed the Shoshone interpreter and 2 elders watching the drift mouth from a distance. Briggs spoke to them briefly, waving them off with a sharp gesture, and they left without stepping inside for coffee. The bunkhouse felt colder that night, and even the stove struggled to warm the air. At first light, frost dusted the rails. We checked our lamps and walked in silence down into the ridge. At the breach, the air tugged faintly toward the hollow, as though the chamber breathed. Briggs ordered me, Connolly, and Thomas through first while the others widened the gap. Coal scraped my back as I slid inside. The space opened into a low room of packed earth, ceiling so close I had to bend. My lamp revealed curved walls and a dryness that felt ancient, untouched. Connolly and Thomas joined me, and we tied the rope to a jut of rock. At the chamber's center stood a pale stone pillar, smooth and cool, etched with thin parallel lines that weren't writing yet weren't chance either. Thomas ran his hand across it and recoiled slightly. The pattern felt deliberate, intentional, old in a way I couldn't name. I circled the pillar and found a narrow passage sloping downward. The walls were marked with uneven gouges, as if tools had carved them, but not tools made for human hands. The floor held strange prints, each depression long and split into 3 blunt points. I touched one and felt its sharpened edge, not old, not settled. Conley called me back, holding a thin strip of pale material he'd found near the pillar. It bent without breaking and had ridges along one side. Skin, but not from anything we knew. By then, the others had crawled through, their lamps sending giant shadows crawling over the walls. Briggs had Sparrow draw the pillar's carvings with shaking hands, while Alvarez drifted toward the passage, staring as though he sensed movement deeper in the dark. The unease in that place was like standing inside someone else's lungs. When we climbed back out later, night settled cold over camp. The interpreter returned with one elder, warning Briggs the ridge held old rooms best left alone. Briggs brushed him off again. That night before dawn, I woke to a faint dry tapping from the ridge. Steady, distant, like knuckles on wood far underground. It lingered for several breaths, then stopped. Nobody else stirred, but I lay awake, knowing that whatever lived beneath that ridge had finally noticed we were there. I eased around the pale stone pillar, dragging my fingertips along its cold surface, until my lamp caught the thin corridor angling downward. The walls scraped with uneven scores that looked too deliberate to be natural and too crude to be made by steel. The tool marks overlapped like countless strokes made by hands that didn't care for symmetry, only repetition. Dust had gathered in small curled piles beneath the ridges, the kind produced when something sharp digs again and again over many years. When I crouched and touched one of the shallow imprints on the floor, long, 3-pointed, nothing like a boot heel, the edge felt fresh, crisp, as if whatever left it had passed no more than a day before. Conley called me back with a tremor in his voice, holding a strange strip he'd found near the base of the pillar, a pale piece of something that bent easily without cracking. One side was smooth as old parchment, the other marked with ridges like the underside of a lizard. In our lamplight, it caught a dull sheen that made my skin crawl. Thomas told him to drop it, and Conley set it gently on a piece of rock as if he feared it might move. By then, the rest of the crew were squeezing through the breach, their lamps pushing long, jittering shadows across that hollow room. Briggs entered last, brushing dust from his coat, and walked straight to the pillar like he'd known it would be there. He touched the carvings with the back of his fingers, nodded once, and motioned Sparrow over. Sparrow's hands shook as he copied each line onto the chalkboard, his breath loud in the stillness. Alvarez had drifted toward the narrow passage, staring into the black beyond with a stiff, uneasy posture, like a man watching the mouth of a cave where something might crawl out at any moment. Briggs inspected the strange depressions on the floor and asked how far the tracks ran. I told him they led downward into the passage. He ordered 2 timbers brought to brace the entrance and sent Eli and Alvarez back through the opening. While they were gone, we set an anchor line around the pillar and took a coil with us, Briggs selecting me, Thomas, and Sparrow to scout deeper, while the others widened the chamber. We entered the sloping corridor single file, the walls brushing our shoulders, the floor thick with more of those strange 3-pronged impressions. Here and there a drag mark crossed between them, a long, straight groove, like something heavy pulled behind whatever made the tracks. Connolly whispered that the air felt warmer, and I realized my skin had begun to dampen. My lamp flame burned steadier, as though the air held more weight. We reached a fork where one branch veered left, low-ceilinged and filled with a sharp mineral odor that stung the nose. The other angled right, breathing a faint current of warmer air against my face. Far below, I thought I heard the faint rattle of stone tapping stone. Slow, patient, deliberate. Sparrow stiffened when the sound rose again, barely more than 2 soft clicks drifting through the rock. We chose the right branch and left our mark on the wall with a quick notch. 20 yards in, the passage opened into a secondary chamber, smaller than the first but taller, its floor scattered with thin, pale fragments that disintegrated when touched. The smell here was familiar to the sharp scent drifting from the left branch. Something old, mineral-heavy, unnerving. Dark stains lay across the floor, dried long ago but still holding a faint shadow of color. Sparrow pointed at a wall lined with vertical grooves carved shoulder-high, too smooth to be accidental. At the base of one groove sat a small stone ring with charred residue in its center. I brushed a fingertip against the black dust. It smeared like soot but smelled faintly metallic. The ring was too small for any human cooking fire. more like a tool used to heat something narrow or delicate. Nearby lay hollow bones the length of a finger, brittle as dry reeds. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then the soft rattle from below came again, closer this time, the rhythm as steady as breathing. Sparrow whispered that we should turn back. I didn't argue. We took our notes, marked the chamber, and returned up the passage, pausing at the fork where the sharp odor from the left had grown stronger. When we re-entered the main cavity, Briggs was examining the pillar while the others braced the entrance. He listened, jaw tight, as we described the lower chamber, the grooves, the stains, the soot ring, the bones, and then asked about the sound. I told him it seemed to move, always deeper, always steady. He didn't comment, only told Sparrow to finish the sketching, and ordered us to continue reinforcing the opening. For 2 more hours we worked in that cave, measuring, chiseling, and tying ropes while the stale air pressed against our skin. Briggs told us to keep quiet about everything until survey crew arrived. Men quit when they smell mystery, he said. We'll handle this with facts, not campfire stories. But when we stepped out into the wind, dust swirling in thin sheets across the ground, it was clear none of us felt settled. That evening, the Shoshone interpreter came again with one elder, this time standing a good distance from the cookhouse. Briggs met them halfway. I heard only fragments, old runes, sleeping earth, boundaries not meant for coal picks. Briggs waved them off again. That night, the bunkhouse felt colder. Men spoke in low voices or not at all. Sparrow polished his lamp glass over and over without lighting it. Conley sharpened his pick with slow, repetitive strokes, his eyes unfocused. Alvarez watched the ridge through the window as if expecting something to rise from the shadows. Sometime before sunrise, I woke to an unfamiliar scrape, a soft, dry stirring far off toward the ridge. Not wind, not shifting timber, a pattern. A slow, steady clicking that rose and fell like something communicating beneath the ground. It lasted just long enough to raise every hair on my arms, then faded into silence so complete, it felt intentional. At dawn, when Briggs posted the day's assignments, his voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before. He ordered a deeper push into the passages, and though none of us said it aloud, we all understood the truth. Whatever hollow space we'd cracked open was not empty, and something inside it now knew exactly where to find us. By the time I drifted off again after that strange clicking before dawn, the stove had cooled enough for its iron to snap and pop like settling bones. But morning came all the same, with Briggs standing outside the bunkhouse barking new orders that carried an edge like he'd barely slept. He assigned Thomas to take point on the next descent, with me and Connolly directly behind him, Sparrow recording everything, and Alvarez and Eli hauling timbers while the rest managed spoil. I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small pistol tucked inside Briggs's coat, its grip worn but oiled, and when I glanced at it, he said only that it belonged to the company. We gathered our lamps and gear, hiked the stiff, frosted track, and entered the drift where the air felt warmer than it had the day before, holding a faint haze that swirled in threads whenever our lamps shifted. At the fork, we followed our notches down to the lower chamber, and the moment our light touched the stone ring near the wall grooves, we knew something had changed. The circle of little stones we'd found, arranged so neatly, now lay slightly scattered, as though nudged by something moving through the night. The soot inside the ring, dry and dead the day before, held a darker smear along one edge, as if something warm or damp had run across it not long before. Connolly muttered a curse through his teeth. Sparrow froze mid-sketch. For several seconds, none of us talked, just listened to the faint, rhythmic tapping, rising through the floor, closer now, more deliberate, as if whatever made that sound had drawn nearer since our last visit. A shiver crawled up my spine when I noticed new depressions in the dust near the wall, fresh three-pointed prints, crossing directly over our own footprints from yesterday. Something that walked here, something alive. Briggs crouched, studied the marks with his jaw clenched, then told everyone to hold position. He selected only me and Thomas to follow him deeper past the lower chamber. Sparrow stayed behind with Conley, sketching what he could, while Alvarez positioned himself near the entrance like he intended to watch both passages at once. Briggs kept his hand near the pistol tucked under his coat as we descended the narrower throat of the hill. The passage grew tighter, forcing us to turn our shoulders sideways in some sections, the air pressing heavily against our lungs. My boots slid on loose grit that clicked underfoot like dry teeth. For a long stretch, none of us breathed loudly, each step careful, controlled, while the tapping beneath our feet kept its unchanging two-tap rhythm. Pause, two-tap rhythm, patient, steady, almost mechanical in its consistency. The walls changed deeper in, coal giving way to a dark, dense mineral, laced with pale veins that faded into our lamplight instead of reflecting it. The deeper we went, the more I felt something waiting ahead, as though we were descending into territory that had never belonged to men. Then the corridor opened into a broader chamber, so tall the ceiling swallowed our light. The floor was smooth stone, cold under our boots, broken only by piles of pale fragments that looked like splintered shells or thin bones. Some curved, some thick, none shaped like anything that belonged to cattle or deer or anything else familiar in these hills. A single trough cut into the stone floor stretched from where we stood to the far wall. Long, shallow, scraped clean except for a residue clinging along its length. Thomas crouched, leaned close, then stiffened in a way that made the hair rise along my arms. Briggs knelt beside him, touched a thumb to the residue, and when he lifted it, the smear on his skin glowed red in the lamplight, not faded brown like old blood, but red like something still living. He hissed through his teeth and said in a low voice that we were heading back. None of us argued. We kept our steps tight and careful as we retraced our way to the lower chamber, rope pulled taut in our hands. When we entered, everything looked exactly as we'd left it, except for the faint fear in the eyes of the men waiting for us. Sparrow clutched the chalkboard against his chest like a shield. Alvarez hadn't moved an inch from where he'd placed his lamp. Conley held his pick at the ready as though expecting something to lunge out of the darkness. Briggs ordered all of us to the main chamber and spoke in a steady tone that didn't match the tension in his jaw. He said we would seal the passage until the survey team arrived, that nobody was to speak of the red residue or the new prints or anything else we'd seen. This is company ground, he said. Company will decide what happens next. Outside the drift, daylight hit our eyes too hard, and the cold breeze felt thin. We walked back to camp without a word to anyone. Men who hadn't been down the ridge watched us return with questions ready on their tongues, but said nothing after seeing our faces. That night, after lamps were lowered, the bunkhouse felt like a coffin, with too many hearts beating inside it. Sparrow stared at the rafters without blinking. Connolly rubbed his hands raw. Alvarez prayed into folded palms. The Ward brothers whispered to each other in clipped fragments. I stayed awake listening to the silence until the tapping began again, louder now, measured, drifting through the ground beneath the ridge like a signal meant for us alone. When I stepped outside, others were already there, staring toward the dark hills with pale faces. For several long minutes, the tapping held steady. Then it cut off in an instant. No wind, no movement, just that thick, unnatural stillness that felt like listening for a breath inside a grave. At dawn, Briggs stopped us at the drift mouth and announced that all underground work was suspended until the survey crew arrived. Men grumbled, cursed, muttered about hidden gold and Shoshone curses, but Briggs shut them down with a look. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Every man who'd walked inside that ridge already knew the truth. None of the others dared say aloud. We had opened something in that hill, and it had begun to open something in us. Briggs shut down the men who muttered about curses and gold with a hard command, but it did nothing to settle the nervous air that clung to camp over the next 2 days. As the tapping continued, sometimes drifting through the cold afternoons like distant hammer blows, sometimes rising at night in closer, quicker bursts that made even seasoned miners tense like spooked horses. Sparrow lost weight so fast his cheeks hollowed. Alvarez refused to stand within 10 feet of the ridge. Conley started drinking before dawn, nursing the bottle with both hands like a wounded man gripping a bandage. The Ward brothers spent most of their time behind the tool shed, silent, staring toward the hill, as if waiting for something to step out of the shadows. But the third night changed everything. The tapping shifted, no longer echoing from deep in the ridge but moving closer, inching toward camp with a patient pace that chilled the blood. I was outside then, lamp in hand, when the rhythm thickened into the still air. The sky was clear, stars sharp as broken glass. One by one, men drifted from the bunkhouses without speaking. We gathered near the tool shed, Sparrow wedged between me and Conley, Alvarez hovering behind us. The Ward brothers stood at the front, heads cocked like hunters listening for movement and brush. The tapping stopped. Silence fell so abruptly it rang in my ears. Then came a new noise, a dry scrape, close and low from under the dirt near the shed. Another scrape shuddered beneath the bunkhouse foundation. We all stepped back at once. Briggs burst from his office, pistol drawn, voice low and tight as he asked where the sound came from. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath the shed clicked sharply, a sound like stone sliding against bone. Then nothing. After a long breath, Briggs lowered the pistol and ordered everyone inside, declaring that we'd post an armed watch until dawn. He wasn't shouting anymore. His voice had lost all pretense of authority and carried only the brittle edge of someone clinging to the last thread of control. I sat awake that night with my back against the bunkhouse wall, rep burning low, each breath feeling too loud. Sparrow curled on his bunk, clutching the chalkboard he had used in the chambers. Conley stared at the door like he expected a face to press through the wood. Every time I closed my eyes, the lower chamber returned. The trough stained red, the scattered bones, the fresh impressions crossing our boot prints. Something lived beneath that hill. Something that understood the boundaries we had broken. Briggs paired us for the watch. Connolly and I took the first shift by the shed, lamp set between us on an overturned crate, its weak circle of light barely cutting the darkness. Conley whispered that he'd worked more mines than he could count, and none of them felt like this. None of them felt aware. He said the ridge carried its own presence now, its own cadence, as though the earth itself was adjusting to us intruders. We kept watch for hours and heard nothing. That stillness was worse than the tapping. When the Ward brothers relieved us, I tried to sleep but couldn't. The stove had burned low. The cold settled into the walls, like someone breathing against my neck. At dawn, the cook bell rang, but only half the camp appeared. The rest stayed in their bunks, either sleepless or unwilling to step into the morning air. Briggs ordered the men who hadn't been inside the ridge to continue clearing tailings, while those of us who'd descended were told to stay close to camp until the survey crew arrived. He didn't know when that would be, only that they were traveling by rail and might take days. No one argued. The Shoshone interpreter and the elder returned at noon, standing far from camp this time. Briggs walked to them. The elder spoke for a long time, too low for me to hear, then placed a small hide-wrapped pouch on the ground with a gesture that felt like a warning or a blessing. Briggs kicked it aside and walked away without a word. That night, the tapping returned, but with a new pattern, irregular and deliberate. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, long silence, 4 taps. Each strike felt chosen, communicated. The tension across camp tightened until every man stood outside the bunkhouse listening. Briggs ordered us inside. No one hesitated. We had barely settled when a scream tore through the night. It came from the direction of the tipple, a raw, choked sound that made the hair rise on my neck. Connolly reached the door before I did, Sparrow scrambling behind us, Alvarez and the Ward brothers rushing across the icy ground. In the lamplight, we saw Eli Ward sprinting toward us, his arms flailing, his voice broken by panic. He pointed toward the ridge, mouth twisting around words that wouldn't form. Thomas caught him by the shoulders, tried to steady him, but Eli clawed at his shirt, then at his own throat, as though something inside him refused to let speech escape. A moment later, he collapsed, body rigid, eyes wide and glassy. When I knelt beside him, I felt no breath. Thomas looked down at his brother with a hollow expression, then raised his gaze to Briggs, eyes emptied of everything but a quiet, brittle fury. Briggs ordered us to move the body into the tool shed. We carried Eli wordlessly onto a work table, the cold wood knocking against his stiff limbs. Thomas stood at the door and refused to leave his brother's side. We didn't force him. Dawn brought no warmth. Briggs wanted to bury Eli, but Thomas refused. He insisted the survey team must see the body. Briggs argued that the heat would ruin him in days, but Thomas's voice didn't bend. Briggs finally relented. By noon, new marks appeared in the dirt near the drift, thin, deep gouges cutting straight toward the entrance before disappearing under the timbers. They weren't footprints. They weren't drag marks from animals. They were something else. Signatures carved by claws or tools or limbs shaped for a world beneath ours. The men who saw them backed away in silence, and though no one said it aloud, we all felt the same truth settling like dust into the cracks of our minds. Whatever lived under that ridge was no longer content to stay there. It had begun to move outward, toward us. The gouges leading straight to the drift mouth didn't look like anything left by a shovel, a boot, or the claws of any desert creature I knew. They were too narrow, too deep, too deliberate, etched into the dirt as if something had dragged razor-edged limbs toward the entrance before slipping underneath the timbers and disappearing into the dark. Briggs stared at the marks for a long moment with his jaw clenched tight, then made a decision that told me even he no longer believed his own bravado. He ordered every miner who had never stepped foot inside the ridge to pack their belongings and walk to the nearest rail camp 20 miles east. The company might fire him for it later, but Briggs had stopped caring. The men didn't argue, didn't demand pay, didn't even roll their bedrolls properly. They grabbed what they could carry and left without looking back, moving in a ragged line across the dry flats like prisoners fleeing a battlefield. Only 6 of us remained. Me, Connolly, Alvarez, Sparrow, Thomas Ward, and Briggs himself. We barricaded ourselves inside the bunkhouse with blankets and boards pressed over the windows, lamps turned low, and tools stacked near the door in case anything tried to come through. At dusk, as the last line of light drained behind the ridge, the tapping began again, stronger, closer, more purposeful than ever before. The floor vibrated beneath our boots in faint pulses. Sparrow flinched with every strike, pulling his knees tight to his chest. Briggs sat at the table with his pistol beside him, staring at the door so intensely he barely blinked. Near midnight, the rhythm ceased so abruptly the silence rang inside my skull. Then, in that dead quiet, a new sound brushed the door, a soft scrape, like a palm dragging across wood. The boards bowed inward by a fraction, enough to show weight. Briggs raised the pistol and aimed. Sparrow latched onto my arm hard enough to break skin. The pressure on the door loosened and drifted toward the window. The thin glass flexed under a sliding touch, as though a fingertip, long, cold, precise, tested its strength. Thomas whispered his brother's name, half in grief, half in desperation. His knife gleamed in the lamplight. Then the scraping stopped. For a moment there was nothing, and then the tapping resumed, now from beneath the floorboards, rising from the cellar like coated knocks on a coffin lid. Briggs fired a single shot straight into the boards. The sound that came back up wasn't the echo of wood. It was a low, rattling exhale, too deep for lungs, too dry for any throat. At dawn, the tapping died off again. When we stepped outside, the dirt around the bunkhouse was covered in fresh impressions, the same 3-pointed shapes from the chambers, circling the walls in a perfect wing as though measuring the structure, studying it, memorizing our outline. Not tracks of panic or aimless roaming, tracks of observation, tracks of intelligence. We stayed close together, all of us trembling from exhaustion we didn't want to acknowledge. Briggs ordered that no one, under any circumstance, return inside the ridge. We would wait for the survey crew and leave the moment they arrived. His voice shook each time he tried to sound calm. His shirt was untucked, and when he holstered the pistol, his hand trembled uncontrollably. Thomas returned to the toolshed doorway and stood guard over his brother's body, refusing to move. In daylight, Eli looked strangely peaceful, untouched by the violence that stole his breath. The sun made everything look normal again, too normal, in fact, as if daylight itself were lying to us. Sparrow didn't eat. He sat on the bunkhouse steps, with the chalkboard clutched to his chest like a shield, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Alvarez paced the edges of camp, muttering prayers under his breath, glancing toward the ridge every few seconds, as if expecting something to crawl over it. Connolly sat on a crate, cleaning the metal head of his pick with slow, meticulous strokes that never seemed to end. Briggs told me to burn the rope we'd used in the chambers. Anything that touched those passages shouldn't remain in camp, he said. I carried the rope outside camp, lit it over a pile of brush, and watched the fibers curl and blacken in moments. The smell stung my throat. When I returned, Alvarez asked if I felt different. I told him no, but that was half a lie. The truth was a pressure behind my eyes, a dull rolling sensation like the memory of the tapping had sunk into my skull. Later that afternoon, a sharp crack echoed from the ridge, a sound like a massive stone snapping under strain. Dust plumed from around the drift mouth and drifted across camp. The timbers shifted with a groan. Then a long, grinding rumble rolled under the ground, passing beneath our feet in a brief shudder that rattled my bones. Connolly cursed. Sparrow squeezed his eyes shut. Briggs stood in place, silent, his face pale as chalk, before calling us to gather our belongings. The hill's unstable, he said. We move camp to the creek. Now. He didn't mention what we'd all begun to accept. Instability wasn't the danger. Something alive in that hill was. We dragged our gear to the far side of camp, near the shallow creek where the sun fell fully and no shadows bunched near the ground. Thomas refused to bring Eli's body. He said his brother wouldn't be left alone in the dark. Briggs didn't have the strength to argue. The wind rose by late afternoon, sending sheets of fine dust blowing off the ridge. The smell that drifted across camp, sharp, mineral-heavy, disturbingly familiar, resembled the air in the narrow chamber near the fork. As the sun dipped, the tapping returned, not from the ridge now, but from under the tool shed where Eli's body lay. The same exact rhythm that had first awakened me days earlier. 2 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, measured, unhurried, certain. Thomas's face hardened. He drew his knife and walked toward the shed despite Briggs ordering him to stop. I stepped forward to follow, but Briggs grabbed my coat and yanked me back hard enough to stagger me. Thomas didn't even look over his shoulder. He walked straight into the shed, disappeared through the doorway, and the moment he crossed the threshold, a single violent slam shook the wood from inside. Then silence. Deep, smothering silence that didn't belong to any human world. Briggs raised the pistol, and Alvarez sprinted beside him. Conley and I followed as fast as we could, but even before Briggs yanked the shed door open, I knew with a hollow certainty that whatever Thomas had walked into was something we could never pull him back from. Briggs tore the shed door open with a force that rattled the hinges, and the lantern light spilling in cut across Thomas like a blade. He stood rigidly by the work table, both hands gripping the wooden edge so tightly his knuckles had turned the color of chalk, his shoulders heaving in shallow jolts as if each breath cost him something he no longer wished to pay. Eli's body remained exactly where we had left it, still and cold and untouched. Yet the moment Thomas lifted his head, I felt something inside me tighten. His eyes were wide, pupils blown so large the irises nearly vanished, and there was a tremor in his jaw that looked less like fear and more like resignation. He whispered, in a voice that didn't belong to the same man who had argued with Briggs that morning, that something had pressed up from beneath the floorboards, something cold, something moving with purpose, something that had brushed directly against his boots before retreating. He didn't shout or stammer. His voice was flat, hollow, and final. Briggs tried to draw him away, but Thomas refused to abandon his brother, so we backed out of the shed, leaving him sitting just inside the doorway, knife balanced across his leg, and his eyes fixed on the dirt floor, as though waiting for it to stir again. Night fell fast, swallowing the ridgeline without color, as we clustered by the creek with 3 battered lamps arranged in a weak triangle around us, their flames flickering in the wind. No one slept. Sparrow tucked himself between Conley and me, arms wrapped around his ribs, trembling at every snap of brush. Alvarez stayed on his feet the entire time, unable to sit, unable to look away from the shed. Briggs paced in tight circles, the pistol constantly shifting between his hands, as though his palms would not stop sweating. Sometime around midnight, the tapping returned, first from beneath the shed, then moving along the ground between shed and creek in slow, measured steps. The rhythm wasn't hurried or frantic, it was steady, intelligent, advancing in the same 2-tap pause pattern we had first heard in the chamber. Moments later, a second set of taps began near the drift mouth, then a third near the tailings pile. 3 patterns moving at once, surrounding us in a triangle of deliberate proximity. My throat dried instantly. Sparrow went rigid. Connolly lowered his pick because his hands trembled too badly to keep it raised. The tapping stopped. For a few seconds, the world held its breath. Then came a new sound, something dragging slowly through loose soil near the creek, a long, heavy scrape ending in a faint shift of weight. Briggs lifted the pistol, stepping backward until he stood shoulder to shoulder with us. The lamps flickered violently, and in the wavering light, a shape emerged beyond the creek's edge. It crawled low at first, limbs splayed wide like an animal stalking prey. But when it moved forward, the light caught its skin, a pale, desiccated green, marked with raised ridges along its ribs, as though its flesh had been grown in overlapping scales. Its head was narrow and long, eyes set far apart and dark as obsidian pits. Its mouth opened slowly to reveal rows of pointed teeth, but no sound came out, only short, shallow breaths. Another shape rose behind it, then another. We stood paralyzed, watching as the nearest creature tilted its head in a precise, mechanical rhythm before stepping into the outer ring of lamplight. Standing upright now, it towered over Briggs, its shoulders rolling with each slow breath, its long fingers ending in curved black claws that clacked softly when they flexed. Briggs fired. The shot struck the creature directly in the face, sending a brief burst of gray flesh into the air, but it did not fall. It didn't even recoil. It turned toward him with an unreadable expression and moved with a speed I couldn't track. Tom Briggs sent it to a real page and died in great man. In one blink, it stood 10 feet away. In the next, it struck Briggs's arm with a sweeping slash that sent the pistol spinning across the dirt. Blood poured from 3 clean cuts torn through his coat sleeve. The creature then stepped back, observing us, as if measuring our response. Alvarez shouted that we had to retreat. Conley grabbed Sparrow and hauled him backward. I kept my eyes fixed on the creature nearest us, its dark gaze flicking with every breath we took. 2 more creatures appeared behind the first, forming a slow, silent arc that blocked any path back toward camp or the ridge. They weren't hurting us toward the mine. They were forcing us away from it, pushing us toward the creek, as though we had crossed a boundary they intended to restore. From inside the shed, Thomas shouted that something was moving beneath the floor. His voice sounded strange, steady, almost eerily calm. Briggs staggered to his feet, clutching his bleeding arm, and we began backing toward the creek, keeping the lamps raised between us and the advancing shapes. The creatures matched our pace precisely, stepping forward only when we stepped back, never rushing, just driving us away. When we reached the creek's edge, stones shifting beneath our boots, the creatures halted. Their heads rotated slightly, watching. The nearest one lifted its shoulders and let out a dry hiss, a sound like air forced through brittle cartilage. A second hiss answered from somewhere to the left, then silence. Briggs whispered for us to check the water depth. The creek wasn't deep, but crossing at night was dangerous. Alvarez said we had no choice. Sparrow whimpered that he couldn't swim well, and Connolly told him he'd carry him across. As we prepared to wade through, the creatures stepped backward as a group, still facing us, and repositioned themselves near the shed where Thomas remained. They didn't break formation. They stood like sentinels. Alvarez lunged forward as if to rescue Thomas, but Briggs grabbed him, yanking him back with more strength than I expected from a wounded man. If he chose to stay, Briggs said through gritted teeth, he's already gone. Sparrow released a breathless sob. Alvarez nearly struck Briggs, but the creatures shifted slightly at the movement, and that was enough to stop him cold. Thomas didn't answer our shouts. He sat silhouetted in the doorway, statue still beside his brother's body while the creatures gathered outside. One of them leaned closer to the shed wall, its long fingers curling around the frame. It didn't enter, not yet. We crossed the creek. Conley lifted Sparrow onto his back, lamp held high in his free hand. The icy water swallowed our boots, numbing our legs instantly as the current pushed against us. When he reached the far bank and climbed into the brush, I turned back. The creatures had stopped at the water's edge. They didn't follow. They simply stood there, tall and unmoving, watching us vanish into the dark. The creek water soaked our boots and numbed our shins as we scrambled up the opposite bank, lamps trembling in our hands, each of us turning back again and again to confirm the creatures had not stepped into the water behind us. But they didn't. They stood at the edge with a strange, patient stillness, bodies upright now, their silhouettes rigid against the dim lamplight reflecting off the rippling creek, their heads shifting just slightly to follow our movement into the brush. It was that lack of hurry, their absolute calm, that chilled me more than the sight of their claws or their teeth. Predators lunged, hunted, chased, but these things watched, as if enforcing some old boundary we'd trespassed, shepherding us out rather than striking us down. Behind them, the shed door shuttered from inside, once, then again, and I saw two creatures push it inward with slow, controlled pressure before slipping into the darkness where Thomas sat with Eli's body. He didn't scream, he didn't call out. There was only silence, an awful, accepting silence, as we turned away for good and began our long march to scrub and shadow toward the distant rail spur. The terrain fought us, with loose gravel and brittle sage bushes that snapped underfoot. Our lamps bobbed over the uneven ground, casting thin circles of light that felt too weak, too fragile to keep the night at day. Briggs's wound bled steadily through the cloth tied over it, his breath coming in sharp hitches, but he kept forcing one foot ahead of the other, refusing help unless he staggered so hard I had to grab his arm to keep him upright. Alvarez moved quietly, muttering in Spanish, pausing now and then to scan the ridge behind us. Sparrow clung to Conley's shirt with both fists, so exhausted, his fingers cramped around the fabric. For 2 hours we pushed through open land, following faint moonlit contours, until our lamps began to gutter. When the flames shrank to trembling embers, we found shelter in a shallow wash with a rise of packed earth on one side, a place barely fit for dogs, let alone men. It was enough to huddle behind. Conley jammed his pick into the dirt and slumped against it. Alvarez sat cross-legged facing the direction we'd come, refusing to turn away from the horizon. Sparrow curled up on the ground, shivering violently, until exhaustion dragged him into a shallow, haunted sleep. Briggs tried to rest, but jolted awake every time the pain in his arm surged. I kept scanning the ridge, fighting the memory of those dark, unblinking eyes fixed on us across the creek. What struck me most was the restraint. They could have torn us apart on that bank, but they hadn't. They had only driven us away, herding us like intruders trespassing on ground that belonged to older things. Just before dawn, Sparrow shot upright from a nightmare, gasping that he'd seen a corridor like the one in the lower chamber, stretching into endless dark, with a trough running through it filled not with dry residue, but fresh blood. He said something dragged the body along that trough, hands scraping the stone in slow, steady rhythm. Though he couldn't describe the hands, he covered his face and whispered that he didn't want to remember more. When daylight finally broke, washing the desert in flat, dry color, the ridge behind us looked harmless again. A shapeless rise of stone and dust, no different from any other Nevada hill. Yet all of us knew better. We resumed walking toward the rail spur, eyes burning from grit and exhaustion. By afternoon, we reached the siding shack, a sagging structure with a hand pump and a short stretch of track. The water tasted metallic, but it eased the dryness in our throats. Briggs collapsed against the platform wall, muttering through clenched teeth for Connolly to cut away the sleeve of his coat. The wounds were deep and unnervingly clean, the skin edges too smooth to be torn by rock. We waited there until dusk, but no survey crew arrived, no riders, no telegraph man. As darkness approached again, Briggs insisted we start walking along the rails toward the next settlement. The government needs to hear this, he rasped. Not the company, not the camp, Washington. So we set off once more, our silhouettes flickering against the rail line as the sun dipped. The wooden ties made for easier footing than the open ground. Sparrow walked the ties for balance. Alvarez checked our rear every few minutes. Connolly held his pick like a rifle at port arms, and I stayed beside Briggs, half supporting him as fever simmered beneath his skin. A couple hours after full dark, a single pap rang out along the steel behind us, a sharp metallic knock that vibrated up the track. We froze, ears straining, but no second tap followed. No rhythm, no pursuit. Briggs whispered for us to keep walking, so we did. The next settlement appeared just before dawn, its faint lantern glow flickering like a promise. We reached the telegraph office, and Briggs went inside while I waited on the porch, heart pounding in my throat. Half an hour later, he came out pale and shivering, saying he had sent notices to the nearest law office and to territorial officials. Riders would go to dry camp number 3, he said, and the mine would be sealed permanently. We stayed in that settlement for 3 days. None of us slept well. Sparrow vomited in the mornings from nerves. Alvarez refused to enter any room with a cellar. Connolly paced constantly, unable to remain indoors more than an hour without breaking into a cold sweat. Briggs worsened quickly. His arm turned black around the wounds, a smell rising from the flesh that made the doctor turn away in confusion. He died on the 4th morning, staring at nothing. The doctor ordered an immediate burial. No one objected. That night, a lawman arrived to question us individually. We told him every detail, but his pencil paused more than once as if he doubted every word. 3 days later, the telegraph operator approached us with a shaken expression. A message had returned from the recovery team. They'd found the camp intact, the bunkhouses, the sheds. The drift mouth collapsed under its own weight, but not a single body. Eli was gone. Thomas was gone. Briggs was gone. The inside of every building was clean, undisturbed, like no one had lived there at all. The ground bore no prints, no gouges, no drag marks. The ridge looked untouched. When the operator asked if we'd fabricated the story, none of us replied. I left Nevada that afternoon and never set foot in that territory again. Sparrow disappeared a year later in Idaho without a trace. Connolly died of pneumonia in 1909. Alvarez lived until 1938, but never spoke of that winter, not even on his deathbed. As for me, I still dream of that lower chamber, of the long, narrow depressions in the dust, of the grooves carved along the walls, of the faint tapping that rose like breath from the stone. And every time I wake, I remember one thing with perfect clarity. They let us leave, only because they chose to. When you dig too deep into places that were never meant for human hands, you don't just uncover the past, you wake it. Those miners thought they found a hollow pocket in the ridge. What they cracked open was a doorway, and something on the other side was already listening. If you want more forgotten encounters, sealed reports, and stories pulled out of places the maps refuse to name, you know what to do. This is Captain Rebel, signing off. Stay sharp, stay ready, and keep your lamps burning.